Hi there, welcome to day 4, the last day of our unit on totalitarianism. We're going to wrap it up today and you should be ready to take your test next class. So let's just go ahead and jump right on into it. We're going to talk about nationalism around the world today. Specifically, we're going to talk about Gandhi, who is on the left. We're going to talk about Chiang Kai-shek, who is the guy in the middle. And the guy on the right is Mao Zedong. So you should remember that Germany, at the end of World War I, they ended up having to give up some of their land, some of their territory. It was something they agreed to in the Treaty of Versailles. You'll remember that Great Britain and France ended up splitting up the area that used to belong to Germany here in the Middle East. So Transjordan, Iraq, and Palestine are going to be the British mandates or the British colonies. Eventually, Great Britain is going to make Transjordan and Iraq independent countries, but they're going to hold on to the mandate of Palestine. So, if you remember way back at the very beginning of the year, we talked about how the Jews had been in this area to begin with, and how Judaism had started here, but they were kicked out of Palestine, and so this is how they ended up in Europe. So when the Zionists, they're a group of Jews that they're going to start looking for a homeland. They're going to look for a place that they can call their own. They're going to start moving back into this area, into Palestine. And so this has the potential for problems to occur between the Jews and the Palestinian Arabs that are living there and have been living there for quite some time. But we are going to discuss that more later. But right now, all you need to know is that this is what's going on in this area at this time. So let's talk about Gandhi first. So India is still controlled by Great Britain as well. And during World War I, there were thousands and thousands of Indians who had fought for Great Britain during World War I. So the British government had promised in return for their service to Great Britain that India would eventually have a self-government, because Great Britain was going to have some reforms after World War I. Well, once the Indian troops have begun to come home from war, they're expecting Great Britain to fulfill their promise of self-government for India. Well, Great Britain doesn't do that immediately. And actually, they treat the soldiers quite poorly. They treat them as though they are second-class citizens. So radical nationalists are going to be highly upset about this. Now, this is interesting because this is where we see, remember that we have Hindus that make up the Congress, and then you have the National Muslim League here in India as well. But now is a time when we are going to see both of these groups come together to fight for independence of India from Great Britain. So to kind of keep things calm in India, Great Britain is going to pass what they call the Rowlatt Acts in 1919. And what this basically does, it's a law that allows the government to jail protesters for up to 2 years without a trial. So if you were protesting, you could be put in jail for up to 2 years just for protesting. So for Indians who had been educated in the West, they knew that this violated individual rights, and they had a major issue with this. So in protest, about 10,000 Hindus and Muslims go to Amritsar, which is a major city in the Punjab, which is an area of India. And so when they're there, the British government sees this as a big nationalist outburst. And so it scares the British. So what they end up doing is the British commander that was there at Amritsar, he tells his troops to fire on the crowds. And so you end up, they're in a confined courtyard area, the Hindus and the Muslims are, and so they're just they're there. They don't really have an easy way to get out of this courtyard. And so the British soldiers, they fire into the crowd. You end up with about 400 people who were killed and about 1,200 who were injured. And the whole time frame of this massacre is about 10 minutes. Okay, so news of this starts to spread across India. And almost overnight, the millions of Indians who had been supportive of the British government, who had been compliant and been loyal to them, they turn into nationalists. And so now we're going to see that the Indians are going to demand their independence. Now here's where Gandhi comes into play. Gandhi is he's a pacifist, okay? So he opposes violence, but he does support civil disobedience. In some of the ways that he does that, so civil disobedience is also passive resistance. So it's non-violently refusing to do what you've been asked to do. So one of the things that they do, they boycott. Gandhi had called on Indians to refuse to buy any kind of British goods, attend any government schools, pay British taxes, or vote in elections. So he actually managed to stage a very successful boycott of British cloth, which was a big source of income for the British. So all Indians were urged to weave their own cloth, and Gandhi himself had devoted 2 hours each day into spinning his own yarn on a very simple hand wheel, so like a spinning wheel. And he wore only homespun cloth and encouraged fellow Indians to do the same thing. So as a result, the British are going to be impacted financially because there is a major drop-off of the sale of British cloth in India. Not paying taxes was another one. He also is going to encourage folks to have sit-ins. So a sit-in is when you basically just sit somewhere until you're forced to leave or until you get your point across. One other thing that Gandhi had encouraged his fellow Indians to do is that, if you remember that Great Britain had the Salt Act, which they had put into place in India. So it basically said that Indians could only buy salt from Great Britain, and they also had to pay taxes on this salt as well. So in order to show their unhappiness with this, to show that they were not pleased with the way this was going, Gandhi encourages his followers to walk about 240 miles to the seacoast. And that's where they start making their own salt by collecting seawater and then letting the water evaporate, so that what's left behind is the salt that had been in the seawater. So this peaceful protest was called the Salt March. Soon afterward, there were some demonstrators that planned to march to a site where the British government had processed salt. So they had intended with the intent of shutting down the salt works. There were police officers that had steel-tipped clubs there that ended up attacking the demonstrators. And so this ends up getting reported across the globe. There was a young American journalist there who witnessed it, and the way that he described it was a sickening whack of clubs on unprotected skulls, and that people were writhing in pain with fractured skulls or broken shoulders. But the Indians were very persistent. They still continued to march peacefully, and they refused to defend themselves against their attackers. So, like I said, the newspapers from across the globe, they're going to catch wind of this. They're going to hear about the story, and they're going to put it out there. And so, of course, this is now going to win worldwide support for Gandhi and for the Indians of the nationalist Indians of India who want to become their own government. Eventually, there were about 60,000 people who were arrested, and Gandhi was, of course, one of them as well. All right, China, this guy here, this is Chiang Kai-shek. He had taken over the Nationalist Party in China after World War I. He ends up getting rid of warlords, and he's able to establish a dictatorship instead. So China has become a little bit more industrialized at this point. It's still not as industrialized as other countries in the West. It's severely lacking. But there were a few things that were successful. So in China, they were able to build roads, they were able to build railroads, they were able to establish banks and improve education as well. So all of these things come about as a positive result of the little bit of industrialization that has happened there in China. But there also were some things that were not so great here. So there were very oppressive landowning policies. So only a few people were qualified to own land. Now this is a problem if you are in a country that is not very industrialized like China, because most of your income for people, it's going to come from agriculture. So if you don't have any land to own, if the laws about who can own land and who can't own land, if it's income driven at all or social status driven at all, you're going to have folks who aren't going to be able to own land. They're not going to be able to farm. They're not going to be able to support their families, and that's going to be a problem. They also have a tax collection system that's set in place that, again, is not very beneficial to your working class or to your peasants. So your peasants are the ones who end up continuing to be poor and to suffer. So they're going to look for a way to improve their situation. And what they end up turning towards is going to be communism. Okay, so this is when communism is really going to take root in China, and it's going to start to threaten the Nationalist Party. Now, the Nationalist Party, remember, they're the ones who are in charge of the government. They're going to see this problem, and they're going to realize that they need to do something to get rid of this communist threat. So, what do you think this leads to? We've seen this happen time and time and time again all year this year. So we know that this is going to end up leading to a civil war between the nationalists and the communists.